All right. We could take our seats. This hearing will come to order. Welcome, everyone. The subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on U.S. relationships with the Gulf states. As you have heard, there are 2 votes on the floor. So I'm going to offer my opening statement, and then we'll run to vote. And there are only 2 votes. We'll come back for the hearing. I thank Mr. Lenderking for being here today. We're pleased to have someone from the administration discuss our policy and relationships in this very important region, and I will recognize myself for the purpose of making an opening statement. Thanks again, Mr. Lenderking, for testifying today and for your service to our country. Our hearing today will examine opportunities and challenges in our relationships with the states in the Arabian Gulf region. Our partnerships with these states are enduring, and many date back to the end of the Second World War. The Gulf has been a focal point of U.S. foreign policy under both Democratic and Republican administrations. In his 1980 State of the Union address, President Jimmy Carter articulated the Carter Doctrine, which stated that the United States would use military force if necessary to defend its national interest in the Gulf. The late President George H.W. Bush acted on this doctrine when he sent 500,000 U.S. troops to liberate Kuwait in 1991. In recent years, our relationships with the Gulf states have faced many challenges, from 9/11 to the Iraq War to disagreements over the Arab Spring, yet these ties have endured. It is precisely because of this region's importance that I am perplexed and concerned that so many of our key partners lack U.S. ambassadors. We have no ambassador in Qatar, we have no ambassador in the UAE, and only last month was an ambassador to Saudi Arabia confirmed. Mr. Lenderking, you are a talented and respected diplomat, but you cannot be everywhere all the time addressing all of the region's challenges. I believe our partnerships with Gulf states are vital to our national security and geopolitical stability. We're grateful to the nations who host our service members. Our forward deployed presence is absolutely critical to peace and stability in the region. However, we must view these relationships through the prism of our own interests and values as well. Where do our priorities align? What types of actions undermine our goals and our values? We should honestly evaluate where our interests and values diverge, identify actions that undermine our mutual objectives, and be willing to express our opposition when our regional partners do not live up to these standards. We must never sacrifice our values, even if it makes our partners uncomfortable. Unfortunately, we've seen senior members of this administration turn a blind eye to actions that run counter to our interests and our values. Their motivation is unclear, but the impacts are manifesting themselves in numerous ways, whether it be brutal human rights violations like the horrific murder of Jamal Khashoggi, or troubling alliances of convenience with groups that have posed a threat to the United States in Yemen. The administration's refusal to acknowledge the serious bipartisan concern with many policy decisions, like the veto of the bipartisan bicameral legislation to remove U.S. support for the war in Yemen, or the refusal to comply with a congressional request for a determination on global Magnitsky sanctions with respect to the Khashoggi murder, raises even further questions about its intentions and is, quite frankly, unacceptable. The focal point of the administration's policy in the Gulf appears to be countering Iran. This is an interest that we share with states of the region. Yet even though we share this goal and recognize the very real threat that Iran poses to our partners and to our own interests, we cannot just give our partners in the Gulf a free pass if their behavior damages other U.S. interests or contradicts our values. We can't just look the other way while the Saudi-led war in Yemen results in the loss of more and more innocent lives and a growing humanitarian catastrophe, and simply shift all of the blame to the atrocities committed by Iran. We cannot stay silent if the UAE hacks into the personal information of activists and dissidents, including U.S. citizens. We can't avert our eyes when regional partners from Qatar to Saudi Arabia to Bahrain violate the human rights of foreign workers and their own citizens. And if we're serious about countering Iran, we must resolve the GCC rift, which has dragged on now for almost 2 years. We are stronger when there is unity among our partners and when we don't give bad actors like Iran any space to attempt to exploit discord. I'm worried the Trump administration has provided a free pass to our regional partners on too many issues, and that ultimately that may undermine our goals. I hope Mr. Lenderking can provide a clear assessment of the opportunities and the challenges facing the United States, and how United States policy can foster an approach to the Gulf that secures our interests and that does so without sacrificing our values. And with that, we will recess until after votes, come back and give the ranking member the opportunity to present an opening statement, and then we'll turn to you, Mr. Lenderking, and we will recess until then. All right, I call this hearing back in order. Excuse me, and I recognize the ranking member for the purpose of making an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Deutsch, for calling this hearing today on relations between the U.S. and our allies in the Gulf. The United States is fortunate to have many friends in such a critically important region of the world. Our country's relationship with Saudi Arabia was solidified aboard the USS Quincy in 1945 as President Franklin Delano Roosevelt met with the kingdom's founder, King Abdulaziz. Since that time, Washington and Riyadh have developed a robust historical relationship and close security ties. U.S.-Bahrain relations stretch back to 1903 and bilateral security ties with Bahrain back to the end of World War II. Bahrain hosts 7,000 U.S. military personnel and serves as the headquarters for NAVCENT in the U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet. Kuwait now hosts over 13,000 U.S. military personnel. Only Germany, Japan, and South Korea host more U.S. troops than Kuwait. Extensive U.S.-Qatar defense and security relations were recently highlighted by the U.S.-Qatar Strategic Dialogue in Washington in January 2018 and Doha, January 2019. The United Arab Emirates host about 5,000 U.S. troops, and the UAE forces have served alongside U.S. troops in Somalia, the Balkans, Afghanistan, Libya, and Syria. Last but certainly not least, Oman was the very first Gulf state to permit U.S. military use of its facilities in 1980. Since that time, Oman has hosted U.S. forces during every military operation in the Middle East. I look forward to our discussion with Deputy Assistant Secretary Linda King today about how we can maintain these partnerships while confronting the many challenges of the region. The ongoing war in Yemen between the Iran-backed Houthi rebels and the internationally recognized government of Yemen, backed by a Saudi-led coalition, has created a dire humanitarian crisis affecting Yemeni citizens. I look forward to hearing from Mr. Linder King about the status of the UN peace process and how Congress and the administration can work together to support that process. I'm also increasingly concerned that Iran, the Houthi rebels' main backer, is simply not incentivized to see an end to the hostilities in Yemen. Iran seeks to exert its influence in the region by fostering a network of armed groups and proxies loyal to Tehran. Last summer, the State Department designated the Al-Ashtar Brigades in Bahrain as an Iranian-backed terrorist group for the designs to overthrow the government in Manama. Better understanding the threats that Iran poses to our GCC partners can help Congress develop policy solutions to support the Gulf countries against this threat. Internal GCC divisions remain a serious challenge. The GCC dispute resulting in Qatar's isolation has dragged on since June 2017. It has proven immensely counterproductive and problematic in both U.S. policy and regional stability. I hope Mr. Linder King can update us on mediation efforts and how the crisis is affecting the region. Finally, members on both sides of the aisle remain, of course, concerned by the human rights situation across the region, but particularly in Saudi Arabia. Concerning the developments of the past year include the reported imprisonment of several U.S. citizens, the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, and the reported imprisonment and torture of peaceful women's rights activists. We support Saudi Arabia's efforts to modernize its economy for long-term success, but that modernization must include improvement on human rights issues. I welcome an update from Mr. Linder King on efforts to obtain justice for Mr. Khashoggi's murder and on United States efforts to leverage human rights reforms in Saudi Arabia. I look forward to hearing from our witness today. Thank you again, Chairman Deutsch, and I yield back my time.
Thank you, Ranking Member Wilson. Without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, and extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitations in the rules. It's now a pleasure to introduce our witness, Mr. Tim Lenderking. Mr. Lenderking currently serves as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Arabian Gulf Affairs in the Near East Bureau at the U.S. Department of State. He is a career member of the Senior Foreign Service, having served in U.S. embassies in Riyadh, Baghdad, Kuwait, and Rabat, and held numerous foreign service posts both domestically and internationally. Mr. Lenderking joined the Foreign Service after a career in the refugee field, where he held numerous positions with American NGOs and with the United Nations in New York, Sudan, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Thailand. He has had a most distinguished career, and on top of that distinguished career, it is also Das Lenderking's birthday, which I am certain he is thrilled to be spending with all of us here at the subcommittee. So from all of us, Mr. Lenderking, we are glad you are here, and we wish you a very joyous birthday. Before you begin, let me just remind you that if you could limit your testimony to 5 minutes, and without objection, your prepared written statement will be made part of the hearing record. I'm really grateful that you're here with us today, and I will recognize you for your testimony, Mr. Lenderking.
Chairman Deutsch, Ranking Member Wilson, first of all, thank you for the very kind birthday wishes, and mine to yours, belatedly, but happy birthday to you. Chairman Deutsch, Ranking Member Wilson, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify. As you know, the Middle East is a critical region for U.S. interests, and the Arabian Peninsula remains a key focus of our foreign policy. As Secretary Pompeo said earlier this year in Cairo, a strong, secure, and economically vibrant Middle East is in our national interest. It's clear that we have a considerable stake in the region's stability. The most urgent challenge facing the region, and one of the greatest threats to our national security, is Iran's destabilizing activities. Iran is the world's leading state sponsor of terror, spends millions of dollars supporting terrorist groups and proxy organizations that threaten our interests and stoke deadly conflict. Iranian malign activity in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen, and Iran's continued support for designated terrorist groups, such as Lebanese Hezbollah, threatens Israel and prolongs regional conflicts. Iran is pursuing dangerous ballistic missile technology that will potentially threaten our security. This administration is engaged in a powerful pressure campaign to cut off the revenues the Iranian regime uses to spread terror and destruction throughout the world. That pressure campaign is working. Our oil sanctions have taken over 1.5 million barrels of Iranian oil exports off the market since May 2018. 23 entities have reduced their purchases of Iranian crude to zero. These actions deny critical revenue for Iran's malign activities. We've designated the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC, as a foreign terrorist organization. Trump administration is focused on protecting America's homeland and America's national security interests. We actively counter the threat from terrorist groups and states that sponsor terrorism. We work to ensure natural resources and international commerce flow freely, and we continue to maintain our steadfast commitment to the protection of our strongest partners, including Israel. We firmly believe that the challenges and opportunities in the Gulf region mandate continued U.S. engagement. One clear challenge noted heretofore is in the area of human rights. At the highest levels, we regularly raise the importance of human rights and respect for international obligations and commitments. We emphasize the importance of the humane treatment of detainees and thorough investigation of and accountability for allegations of abuse. I know this subcommittee shares our concerns, and we have spoken out publicly about them. We continue to do so in our private diplomatic engagement as well. Our recently released human rights reports demonstrate the concerns we have with each of our Gulf partners to varying degrees. For example, our policy in Bahrain is to encourage reform, reconciliation, and respect for freedom of expression, peaceful assembly, and association. We were also horrified by the murder of Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi. It was a heinous act, and we want to be clear that full accountability for those responsible has not yet been achieved. We've been forthright with the Saudi leadership that there must be honest, credible justice for Mr. Khashoggi. We also continue to press Riyadh on its detention of several U.S. citizens and numerous human rights advocates. Ambassador Abizaid arrived in Riyadh just this past week, and I know that one of his priorities will be addressing these issues in the weeks ahead. China's burgeoning economic influence in the Gulf is another challenge. We have been candid in sharing our concerns with governments in the region. This includes the telecommunications sector and the rollout of 5G in particular. To ensure a fair playing field for U.S. companies, we continue to stress the importance of market principles and transparent market access requirements. A third challenge is the Gulf dispute with Qatar, involving Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, and Egypt. As Secretary Pompeo has said, we need the Gulf countries working together on the complex set of challenges that face each of our interests in the region. We view a resolution to the dispute as in the best interests of the countries involved and in our national security interests as well. We've emphasized that the Gulf dispute benefits Iran. We spent a lot of time talking about the challenges in the Gulf, and they are no doubt there, but let's remember the opportunities for us that stem from our engagement. Our shared interests, countering terrorism, fostering economic development, countering Iran's malign activity, provide an opportunity to bring our partners together. We're also asking the GCC countries to do more to resolve regional crises like Libya, Sudan, and Lebanon, and to partner with us in those endeavors. We stand ready to work with all of our partners to address the challenges we face. Chairman Deutsch, Ranking Member Wilson, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I welcome the opportunity to answer your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lenderking, for your testimony. We'll now move to member questions. Under the 5-minute rule, I'll begin, followed by Ranking Member Wilson, and then we'll alternate between the parties. Let me just begin by acknowledging, Mr. Lenderking, that we ask a lot of some of our partners, often asking them to change behavior on issues that we don't always see eye to eye on. We want cooperation on Iran. We want help countering Russian and Chinese influence. We have asked in Syria and Libya, and we want responsible action to bring the war in Yemen to a halt. And we want to be clear that human rights is not a secondary concern. All of these affect U.S. national security. I personally don't believe that we're asking too much, but it seems like the President and other top advisors believe that in order to get cooperation in some areas, we have to push other issues further down the list. So I would just ask you let me just give you the opportunity to share with the subcommittee what are our consistent messages to Gulf partners. If you could correct the record, help us understand what those messages look like and sound like.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think first and foremost, we talk about the threats that we're facing together, which we believe that are also issues that threaten the Gulf countries. I've mentioned Iran's malign influence. This plays out in varying degrees to each of the countries. In Yemen, unfortunately, with the civil war continuing to rage, we see that the Houthis, who are aided and abetted, although not proxies of the Iranians, that they, just as Ranking Member Wilson said, the Iranians show no inclination, unfortunately, to help bring that conflict to a close. So we do see that the Iranians are supporting the Houthis in ways that are fueling the conflict. So we have a host of security issues. We've talked about human rights, and I think that's a crucial area where we do a lot privately when necessary. As I mentioned, our human rights reports, which are in the public domain. We do a lot of very private messaging with the Saudi leadership, and I think Ambassador Abizaid will take that on as a key challenge. Another primary area for us—
Mr. Lenderking, so I understand private messaging, you're not going to be willing to tell us exactly what the wording of that messaging is, but if you could give us some sense when it comes to human rights, the general nature of that private messaging.
Of course, I think in each of the countries, the messaging is different. I mean, there are commonalities, I would say, common principles, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, et cetera, that are part of our human rights dialogue. But if you take the case of Bahrain, we've had an ongoing conversation stemming back to some of the concerns we've felt about their handling of the Shia population. That goes back several years. That's a particular area of concern. On the other hand, we were heartened to see the record turnout in the recent parliamentary elections, the election of a female Speaker of Parliament, very much on the positive side. Bahrain has a very good track record in terms of trafficking in persons, so that's very much on the positive side. Saudi Arabia, of course, the crucial issue has been the ones I've mentioned, the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, which we note in our human rights report, was conducted by government agents. So we're quite public and quite direct about that. Secretary Pompeo has indicated, including most recently in late April, we continue to investigate. We call on Saudi Arabia to take measures against those responsible all the way up to the highest levels.
What's the status of that investigation?
The status of the investigation is that the Saudis have a legal process underway. We may not be totally satisfied with the pace of it. They have a different legal system. The Saudis have asked for our patience to let the legal proceedings continue. This is not something that we're going to allow to be swept under the table or buried under other priority issues.
So I appreciate that, Mr. Leonard King, but even as that investigation plays out, we could talk about the hurdles and the timing and why it takes so long. Even as that plays out, we've seen human rights activists, more than 24 detained since last May. The question is, how do we push back against, it's not just that horrific case, how do we push back against the Saudi's human rights violations? Should the administration consider applying Global Magnitsky Act sanctions against Saudi officials responsible for unjust treatment, not just in connection with the Khashoggi case, but unjust treatment of these activists if there's credible evidence, especially that if there's credible evidence that there's been abuse or torture?
Mr. Chairman, I think the Global Magnitsky parameters are something that we constantly look at. So if we feel that they apply in other cases, we would, of course, take a serious look at that. We have, as noted, identified 17 individuals. We did that sort of right off the bat within a month or so of Khashoggi's killing. We've utilized other legal measures to block visas for others whom we deem were involved in that case.
But even just as I wrap up, in addition to the Khashoggi case, is there an ongoing review of Global Magnitsky Act sanctions and the potential application of those sanctions to individuals in connection with either abuse or torture, if there's credible evidence that exists?
I will say that there isn't directly at this particular time. I would say we're prepared to go in that direction should information come to us that would rise to that level.
Thank you. Mr. Wilson.
And thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Leonard King, thank you for being here today. And in January, Representative Keating and I introduced H.R. 554, the Saudi Educational Transparency and Reform Act, which highlights Saudi Arabia's inflammatory education curriculum. Is the State Department working with Saudi Arabia on this issue?
We are indeed. This has been an issue that we've been looking at for several years. Particularly problematic are textbooks that we have sought to work with the Saudis on that has demeaning language toward, for example, Shia, which we think is not in keeping certainly with the direction that the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia wants to take the country. He's talked about the importance of Saudi Arabia returning to a moderate Islam. Educational reform, what kids are taught in schools, we would see as a vital part of that. So we have worked with the Saudis on that effort. We've seen some improvement, more work to be done.
And with the effort in Saudi Arabia, the focus there of human rights and rule of law, what is the status of working with Kuwait and its level of progress in developing human rights and rule of law, and what is the State Department doing to promote the most open society that could be?
We also highlight a number of issues in our human rights report pertaining to Kuwait, so that's very much an active dialogue. We don't have the same ferocity, I would say, on the human rights issues that we do with the Saudis at this particular time. But we have had concerns about freedom of assembly and other issues that we continue to raise with the Kuwaiti government.
And also possibly detention issues of persons in that country?
Of detentions?
Yes.
Yes, we're aware of certain particular cases right now that we're working on and that we're working to resolve as quickly as we can.
That's greatly appreciated. And then the ongoing dispute with Qatar and its neighbors, how does this affect American interest in the Middle East?
We believe that the blockade of Qatar, its airspace, its land border, is beneficial to Iran, and we don't believe that this blockade or dispute with Qatar serves even the interests of those who are doing it. We've thrown ourselves at it quite strongly at various points. I've traveled with special envoys to the region on a number of occasions, and we have sought to deliver messages to the leadership of all of the countries concerned to work out their differences. We've supported the Kuwaitis as a mediator and very much value the role that they have played. We're not there yet. We'd also like to look at other measures. We've assumed that the blockade couldn't necessarily be lifted in one bite, so to speak. Let's look at ways that pilgrims moving to the Hajj, for example, can be helped to perform their religious duties. Let's look at family reunification. There are numerous ways that we think the Gulf countries could chip away at some of the issues. But I think the main point is that we are better united, just as you said, Congressman, that these countries, when we look at the region, we count on them to work with us in confronting, regional challenges across the board.
And including working together with us. Sadly, there's been terror financing from the GCC countries. Have we identified who the recipients, which terrorist groups are receiving funds, and what efforts are being made to deter further financing?
We have a very strong dialogue with the Gulf countries on terrorism financing. We partner with our Treasury colleagues who often have the lead on this particular issue. We have seen some improvements. We've seen the Saudis move up the ranking in this particular area. We're very glad for that. But I would say across the board, there's more work that could be done, particularly as we look at Iranian financial flows in and out of the Gulf. And as we scrutinize that area more, we will be going to our Gulf partners to do more heavy lifting.
And with your extraordinary background in the Middle East, do you believe that progress is being made in regard to human rights for the citizens of the region?
Oh, I think there is progress. We oftentimes say there's 3 steps forward and 2 back. We're trying to avoid that. It'd be great to have 5 steps forward and no back. So that's very much the posture that we take, is that the human rights improvements that we're pushing for, we think are beneficial to those countries. We wouldn't do it otherwise. But we also think we have strong interests to advocate for, and I'm sure we will continue to do so.
Thank you for your service.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. We've been joined by the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Chairman Engel. You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's strange to be all the way over on the side. I haven't been here in years, no. But thank you, and thanks to members of the subcommittee for letting me speak. So let me say, Mr. Deutsch, Chairman Deutsch, Ranking Member Wilson, Mr. Lenderking, members of the subcommittee. I welcome the opportunity to address the many challenges and opportunities in the U.S. relationship with the Arabian Gulf. Right now, our relationships have been consumed by human rights and accountability issues. They've been hampered by foreign policy concerns, where our interests diverge. In Saudi Arabia, the murder of Jamal Khashoggi and the imprisonment of an American physician, of 2 American journalists, and of women activists and bloggers have certainly hindered and made more difficult our relationship. In order to move past these issues, the United States will need to see real changes. I want to move past these issues, but we can't really be business as usual. With respect to the UAE, our security cooperation remains strong, but serious concerns remain about reports that military equipment made in the United States and sold to the Emiratis has ended up in the hands of third parties, even extremists. We're also closely monitoring how the UAE is influencing various conflicts around the world, from Sudan to Libya to Somalia. And Yemen has been a major concern of this committee. Unfortunately, we have not seen nearly enough accountability for attacks against civilians. A funeral, a fishing boat, a Save the Children's Hospital. Our partners must do better than this, and we need to insist on it. And this committee, I believe, has a role to play. I believe that the best approach moving forward is to limit assistance to our partners, including weapons transfers, if they cannot meet our expectations. Let me be clear, though. The Houthis are equally at fault. They have resisted implementation of the Stockholm Agreement, blocked humanitarian assistance from getting to vulnerable Yemenis, and committed atrocities against detainees. But we cannot simply look the other way when our partners' behavior has been so troubling. At the same time, we have a real interest in continuing to work with these partners on issues of mutual concern. Our Gulf partners are playing a constructive role in the Israeli-Palestinian context, reportedly building back-channel cooperation with Israel and backfilling U.S. commitments to Palestinian assistance. Qatar has made a positive impact in the stabilization of Gaza, working through Israel, not counter to Israel, and this is a welcome newer development. The United States and Gulf partners share economic opportunities, anti-terrorism concerns, and can be working together to counter the threat posed by Iran. For this to happen, a unified Gulf is essential, but so far, we have not seen, unfortunately, enough progress to end the Qatar blockade. It is in all parties' interest to end this blockade so that we can work together to counter the real threats in the region. At the very least, Gulf countries should allow Qatar overflight rights so that each flight out of Doha does not put money in Iran's pockets. Again, I thank the members of the subcommittee, particularly the chairman and ranking member, for devoting much-needed attention to the opportunities and challenges in the Gulf, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The chairman yields back. Mr. Liu, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Secretary Leonard King, for your service in both Democratic and Republican administrations. I note that you were the Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia from 2013 to 2016. So I'm going to ask you some questions about Saudi Arabia and then about Yemen. Does the Trump administration, so let me first ask about Jamal Khashoggi. As you know, Saudi Arabian officials lured him into a Saudi embassy, even though he was an American resident, and they murdered him and then cut his body into parts using a bone saw. Does the Trump administration know where Khashoggi's body parts are?
We do not.
Okay. Do you believe that Khashoggi's family should have the dignity and respect of having his body?
Yes, I think we would support that, of course.
Has the Trump administration made a request to Saudi Arabia asking for Khashoggi's body?
We have.
Okay, and how has Saudi Arabia responded to that request?
Thus far, the Saudis have responded that they do not know where the body is.
Do you believe that? I mean, they killed him.
I think there are things that we don't know about what went on in the consulate and thereafter, and I speak honestly when I tell all of you that when Secretary Pompeo says that there's more to be investigated, that's the case, including on this particular issue.
Well, I'm glad you raised that. So I would like to enter into the record, Mr. Chair, an article in the Washington Post. It's titled, CIA Concludes Saudi Crown Prince Ordered Jamal Khashoggi's Assassination. It's dated November 16, 2018. Mr. Chair, if I enter that into the record.
Without objection.
So the CIA has concluded that the Saudi Crown Prince ordered Khashoggi's assassination. Do you share that view?
Mr. Congressman, I have not seen anything, nor, I believe, has Secretary Pompeo to corroborate that point of view.
So the article notes that the CIA has concluded that with high assessment. Have you gotten a briefing from the CIA on that issue?
I've had some conversations, of course, with the CIA about this issue.
So what is the State Department doing to try to get more information either on who killed Khashoggi, if it's not the CIA saying the Crown Prince did it, and where his body is?
Well, I would leave to intel channels the way that, you know, some of those issues. But I would say that in our private engagement with the Saudis, this is very much a live issue. And as I said in my statement, we're not satisfied in a number of areas: accountability, credibility. You mentioned the body. These are things that I think the Saudis still owe us.
Thank you. I'd like to move on to Yemen. On March 26th, the 4-year anniversary of the conflict in Yemen, a hospital in northern Yemen supported by Save Their Children with funding from USAID was partially destroyed in an airstrike, and several children and healthcare workers were killed. Has the administration made any efforts to investigate this incident?
Sometimes our efforts to investigate on our own are quite limited, given the fact that we don't have a large presence inside Yemen to investigate directly, so we are reliant to some extent on the coalition. But yes, we have pressed this issue with the Saudis, with the Saudi-led coalition, and we understand that the strike was on a hospital. It wasn't on, was not on the hospital, but on a nearby facility, at which there was some indication that there were Houthi elements, but we understand that the Saudis have acknowledged that there was some civilian casualties.
All right. Thank you. Now, if the investigation determines that the Saudis or Emiratis are responsible for destroying part of a hospital supported with U.S. taxpayer dollars, what actions would the administration plan on taking if that were the case?
Well, you're pointing to a very live subject that we have with the Saudis, an ongoing conversation, a set of training, a set of using our influence to improve Saudi targeting techniques and overall conduct of the war in Yemen. And so this would be very much folded into it. Unfortunately, it's not the first allegation of civilian casualties. I wish I could say it would be the last. But this is an area that we take very seriously, and our leadership in Riyadh, you can imagine under former CENTCOM Commander John Abizaid, that we will continue to do that with the Saudis.
Thank you. This is my last question. I commend the Trump administration for stopping the refueling of Saudi jets. I'd like to know if you could tell us what is the administration doing in terms of support to the Saudi-led military coalition in Yemen?
Part of our support is political, of course, in the sense that we recognize that Saudi Arabia should not lose this conflict in Yemen, that the other side is backed by our enemies, and that we need to continue to support the Saudi-led coalition to, at times when appropriate, keep military pressure on the Houthis. And so we have a few limited ways that we do that. They're not terribly significant, and you're right to point out that we did discontinue the refueling support.
Thank you, Mr. Liu. Mr. Allred, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Lenderking, for being here and for your service across multiple administrations. I want to be clear, though, to follow up on my colleague, Mr. Liu's line of questioning, that you don't accept the CIA's assessment that Jamal Khashoggi's murder was directed by the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia?
I have no independent basis to confirm or deny that one way or the other. I think what we're trying to say is that we haven't gotten to the bottom of it yet.
By we, do we not rely on our intelligence services to make those assessments?
Of course. And we also are relying on Saudis and Turks and others who might have information. And I think the fact that we've continued to identify individuals, and whether it's restrict visas or look at certain individuals under the Global Magnitsky parameters, indicates that this is very much a live issue.
I just find that to be pretty remarkable. I really do, that this administration continues to not accept the conclusions of its own intelligence services. This is not the first instance of this. On this committee, we hear this all the time now, that our intelligence services reach an assessment with high confidence that they don't do very lightly, that they do with corroborating information, and they do in cooperation with our allies and with underlying facts, and that our administration and the President of the United States then says, I don't know if our intelligence service is correct. I'm going to go off my own gut and talk to the Saudis or the Russians or whoever it might be, and maybe they'll be right and not our own intelligence assessments. And to me, this is a larger issue that faces us here, which is, who are we going to trust in our own government? Are we going to trust the intelligence that we receive from our American intelligence services that work very hard to assess this information, to source it, who have people putting their lives on the line at times to get that information? Or are we going to trust the parties that have a self-interest in our own determinations, who then later are allowed to get away with enormous violations of international law, of human rights, And to me, this is a larger national security issue for the United States. And this region is rife with countries that have human rights violations. I recognize that we need them as a counterbalance to Iranian influence. I recognize that we have a military presence in every single one of these countries and that we use them for many purposes. But in my opinion, when we undermine our values and allow human rights violations to take place with our allies, that hurts our overall national security. It makes us less safe because we then encourage extremism. We encourage people to look at the United States as their enemy when we should be encouraging the spread of the values and rules-based order that rules the world and that we've installed since World War II and that is now, I think, being actively undermined around the world at times with this administration just nodding along. And so to me, this is a larger issue. And I want to, in the time that I have left, talk about Bahrain because I have several of my constituents have reached out to me about this, and I want to thank them for reaching out to me about this and about the crackdown on free speech, on any opposition to its leadership that has prevented any real development of any internal democratic institutions. The Obama administration imposed a ban on arms sales to Bahrain that has been lifted by the Trump administration. Has that improved the human rights situation, and why did we reach that decision?
Thank you, Congressman. On Bahrain, I think we do have a pretty active dialogue with the Bahraini leadership about human rights issues. We also talk to human rights advocates inside Bahrain, outside Bahrain. It's helping to enrich and develop our understanding of what's going on there. I couldn't make a direct correlation between the arms sales and the human rights situation. I know that Bahrain remains a critical partner, and that Bahrain is on the front lines of the Iran threat network. They're very close geographically to Iran. We see illicit material flowing into Bahrain. There is a very legitimate security concern that the Bahrainis have. Absolutely. So they got to watch.
Yep.
They got to watch that space.
Thank you. I certainly recognize Bahrain's importance. I want to finish by saying this, which is that private conversations about human rights, putting it in reports that we issue, is not the same as global leadership from the President of the United States, and that's what we need to have on human rights issues. It is a shame that the rest of the world is now looking at the United States no longer as an ally in combating human rights violations, and that we will not speak out more broadly and more forcefully on these issues. And the fact that you're having private conversations is good. I'm glad to hear that, but it's not enough, and the United States is better than that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Albright. Mr. Malinowski, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Linder King. Let me actually pick up with the Bahrain discussion, and I appreciate your opening statement and your answer just now that we are apparently trying to raise these issues, but I am confused because the first and most prominent statement on Bahrain policy that this administration made was made by the President at the very beginning of the administration. He said, quote, "Our countries have a wonderful relationship together, but there has been a little strain, but there won't be a strain with this administration." And that statement coincided with the resumption of arms sales and was interpreted by everybody in Bahrain as a statement that human rights would no longer be an issue. Has our policy changed since the President's statement?
No, it has not changed. I would say that the President is right to herald the good relationship that we have. It was mentioned that they host NAVCENT, and very important resource for us as we try to support security in this vital waterway, the Persian Gulf. But we do, let me assure you, Congressman, and knowing of your interest in our conversations on this topic in the past, that we don't give the Bahrainis a blank check. We do have, a pretty vital conversation, both at the foreign minister level and through our embassy in Manama, back here when the Bahrainis visit. This is very much a part of our discussion with the Bahrainis, and we're looking for improvements in some of the areas that I've noted.
Well, we'll continue that conversation. Let me broaden this out a bit. Your testimony and much of our policy is based on the belief that Iran continues destabilizing activities throughout the region. And let me just state that is, of course, 100% correct, from Syria to Yemen to Lebanon, and a perfectly appropriate focus of our policy. But let me ask you a series of questions about some other countries. Is it correct to say that Saudi Arabia and the UAE are blockading Qatar? Yes or no?
Yes, that is correct. That's part of the Gulf Drift.
Would you agree that a short while ago the Saudi government kidnapped the Prime Minister of Lebanon in an effort to coerce that government to adopt policies more friendly to Saudi interests?
I don't know that I would use the word kidnapped, but there was an unfortunate extra bit of time spent in Saudi Arabia, and we talked to the Saudis about this, and I'm glad we were able to help work this out.
You're a good diplomat. Is it fair to say that the world's worst humanitarian crisis right now is going on in Yemen, and that the suffering is due, at least in part, not wholly, but in part, to actions by the Saudi government and the UAE that the two successive U.S. administrations have urged them to moderate?
That's correct. Let's not give the Houthis a pass on this.
I'm not, but
Okay.
Is it correct to say that the UAE has funded and armed militias in Libya that, right as we speak, are trying to overthrow a government that both the United States and the United Nations has recognized?
I'm not sure that is entirely accurate, Congressman. I think that UAE has an interest in what happens in Libya. We have a very active dialogue with them. We're coordinating with them very closely. And I think we're starting to push for a political process which is the desired outcome of the United States.
As we should be. Yeah. Well, there's reporting that there are UAE-operated drones flying over Tripoli, armed drones on behalf of Hiftar, who is in fact trying to overthrow the legitimate government. Is it true that the Saudi government has operated a team, a security unit dedicated to harassing, kidnapping, perhaps even killing dissidents in other countries, beyond even just the Khashoggi case?
I believe there has been in the past some such organizations. I don't know all the parameters of them. I don't know the marching orders, et cetera. This would be something that we would be concerned about and would address with the Saudis.
So look, you can see where I'm going with this. I could go on to Somalia and Sudan and other examples, but it seems to me we have two powers in the Middle East that are busy destabilizing the region because they are engaged in a civilizational war with each other, Sunni versus Shia. Is it in our interest to take one side in that Cold War, as we seem to be doing right now, when both sides are destabilizing the region?
I think what we'd like to see is Iran to come back in the fold, and the Secretary's laid out 12 points that we hope that the Iranians will recognize the wisdom of. It may be a difficult leap for them. We're very concerned about the way that Iran spreads its tentacles throughout the Gulf into Syria. We have to support the Saudis and the Gulf countries to withstand, I think, the pressure that they're under from the Iranians.
Are they in the fold?
Sorry?
Are the Saudis and the Emiratis in the fold, given the long list that we just went through of destabilizing activities?
On many issues, they are, and where they're not, that's where we are trying to maneuver them into better positions.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Malinowski. Mr. Trone, you're recognized.
I just would follow up with, on Mr. Allred's and Mr. Malinowski's comments. The maneuvering doesn't appear to be going too well. I'm just befuddled how you can say that our own CIA, we're not buying their intelligence. I'm befuddled how you can say he wasn't kidnapped, he was detained. I mean, it must be hard for you to sit there and say that. It'd be hard for me to sit there and say that, given your background and wonderful career. That must be tough. Let's go back to Chairman Engel and Chairman Royce sent a letter to President Trump invoking the Magnitsky Act. The trigger determination was due February the 8th. We haven't heard a word since then. We sent another letter. 40 folks signed off on it. Could I enter this in the record, please?
Objection.
Thank you. So when do we expect to receive? It's mandated that we receive an answer as to the determination as who's responsible for Mr. Khashoggi's killing.
I believe we do owe you a response on that, and I'll certainly take that back, and we'll be as responsive as we can to that letter.
February, March, April, May, can we expect that? When the Prime Minister was detained? Is this going to be one of those type things? Detained, not kidnapped?
No, I don't think so, sir. I think we understand the obligation, and we'll move quickly on it.
How's the administration ensuring Saudi leaders don't believe they're free to kill dissidents and use diplomatic cover to do so? What's the top-to-top messaging?
Sir, what's our messaging to the Saudis?
That they don't have an open hand, a free hand, which they clearly think they do.
Well, I think they don't get that from us, to be honest, and I think we have put in an avalanche of concern about that particular incident, and where we would see such other behavior operating, we would move to stop it.
Yemen. It's part of the Trump travel ban. 36 plaintiffs sued Trump administration in March of 18, claiming the government failed to follow its own guidelines, its own procedures for reviewing the travel ban requests as required by law, waivers. Some plaintiffs reported State Department officials refused to accept documents in support of their waiver requests. Others said they were never given a chance to apply for a waiver. According to Reuters, U.S. government granted waivers only 6% of visa applicants subjected to the travel ban. When Secretary Pompeo was here, I asked him about this when he testified in March, but we didn't get a very clear answer. What is the administration's policy on reviewing and granting waivers, and why is that percentage so abysmally low?
Sir, I'm sorry, I'm not sure of the context in which your question is. I'd be happy to respond, but I'm not quite sure I understand the question.
So there's a Trump travel ban as ability to get around the ban with waivers. And when folks apply for a waiver, there's no response, then eventually 6% get approved. It seems ridiculously low and perhaps punitive.
I'd have to take that back, sir. I'm sorry, I can't.
We'd appreciate it if you could look into that. That'd be good.
Happy to do it.
Are you planning to increase your personnel and resources to maybe process these quicker and address it?
I'd be happy to look into that as well.
Yield back the balance of my time.
If my friend would yield.
I do.
I thank my friend. And without objection, Mr. Chairman, I'd ask this time to just be added to my 5 minutes.
Without objection, Mr.
I
Chairman.
thank the Chair. Mr. Lunderking, and I thank Mr. Trump. Gutter, I want to make sure, I heard your answer earlier, I want to make sure I understand the policy. The policy is we're encouraging our friends to stop it because the feuding with Qatar and the economic sanctions against Qatar are actually strengthening the interest of Iran in the region. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
And we've given that direction. That is our official policy to our other allies in the region, Qatar being, of course, an ally as well.
That's correct.
And have you gotten warm fuzzies from the Saudis in that direction?
Not really. I mean, we've understood that the Saudis have concerns about Qatari behavior that dates back a number of years. We've looked at those concerns. I think, you know, the overwhelming sense of the administration is that we need to get on with Gulf unity. It's important to our interests, and we want to see those countries working together to partner with us on the kind of challenges that we're talking about here today.
Just in terms of trade flows and movement of goods and services, if the Saudis and their allies in the Gulf block Qatar from air rights and border crossings and the like, obviously Qatar has to turn to Iran. Correct?
That's correct,
Yeah.
and that's very unfortunate.
All right. I just want to be real clear that that's our policy, and that's good to know. Iran announced today that given the United States' decision to renounce and walk away from the JCPOA, that it was going to now limit one of the metrics set in the JCPOA, which is the sale and transshipment of enriched uranium. Our allies seem, and our adversaries who were party to the JCPOA, seem rather apoplectic about this and, frankly, hold us responsible for creating an unstable situation where there had been a stable one. Our own government had admitted that heretofore all of the metrics set in the JCPOA had been met, and that Iran had not cheated. What is the position of the administration now? You still believe that we can get a better deal, given the fact we walked away from our own deal? Who's going to believe that? I'm just curious.
Congressman, I'm not, unfortunately, an expert in the JCPOA. I look at it in particular from sort of my foxhole, which is the Iranian threat into the Gulf, and I know that the administration is seeing a number of provocations that are emanating from the Iranians and are moving to address the immediate threat. Of course, from where I sit, I've talked about the areas such as Bahrain and Yemen where the Iranians are particularly active. And so we look to thwart Iran extending its influence into the peninsula.
And I appreciate that and your perspective and responsibilities, Mr. Linder King. I guess I would urge you to take back that at least this member of Congress, and I think I'm not alone, believe the administration itself is fomenting some of that Iranian behavior because we have renounced an agreement we wrote and encouraged all parties to participate in. And the sanctions we've reimposed are causing grief for our allies, but more importantly, obviously, are having effects in Iran that lead to the hardening of the positions, especially of the hardliners who are saying, we told you so. We told you not to trust the Americans. See what happens? And I think that's self-defeating. Speaking for myself, you can feel free to take it back. But I think it's having a very deleterious impact on our diplomacy in the region, and the things you care about are being affected adversely because of that policy. Khashoggi, Jamal Khashoggi was my constituent.
Yes, I understand.
And he was brutally murdered in a consulate of the Saudi government in Istanbul. They lied about it. Initially, their position was, no, he left the consulate healthy and fine. That was a lie. They had to retract that. Well, then it was something happened, we're not quite sure what. Well, we know that 2 teams flew in on airplanes controlled by the Crown Prince with a bone saw, which is not normally a diplomatic tool, unless you want to correct me.
No correction.
I let the record show he did not correct me. And they flew in, clearly with malice aforethought, clearly planned. The Turks, to their credit, kept on issuing intelligence and even transcripts of the brutal murder. And finally, the Saudis had to admit, yeah, no, he was murdered and he was dismembered. Things they denied earlier. And now we're supposed to believe it was something that went wrong, it was a rogue element, and it just comes as a shock to the Crown Prince. Our own intelligence and Turkish intelligence would suggest otherwise, that he in fact was the architect of this brutal murder. What are we going to do if we finally have to confirm that and I understand it's speculation, but this is not idle speculation, that the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, the heir to the throne, was in fact the architect of the murder of a U.S. legal resident in that consulate?
Congressman, I think we will cross that bridge when we come to it, to be honest. I think there are things that we still don't know about what went down there, who actually did what. It underscores, I think, what the Secretary has said, that we're going to follow the trail as high as it goes, and I know he will keep to his word on that. And his instructions to me and others are to continue.
I would just say in closing, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate that, and I asked Mr. Pompeo this series of questions in more detail when he was here a few weeks ago, and he did say that. We don't know what that means. What does that mean? There can't be surprise that he is at best a suspect, at worst much more than that. And so crossing that bridge when we come to it, well, there are those who would argue we've come to that bridge long ago, and we've crossed it. And I guess we're hoping, I don't know, somebody falls off the bridge, or I don't know what. But let me just say, my constituent is dead.
Yeah.
He was murdered. He was a gentle man who cared about his country. And for that, he paid the price of his life. And it seems to me he's entitled to justice, and I want my government to insist on it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Connolly. Mr. Leonard King, there are just a handful of members who have some additional questions, if that's okay with you. Thank you. I'll actually start with the ranking member, Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And just two questions. What milestones or goals are you hoping to achieve this year in the path to forming the Middle East Strategic Alliance?
Thank you for raising that, Congressman. We are keen to bind the region together, as we've been talking, in a Middle East Strategic Alliance that brings together strategic and political and economic and energy interests. We have had numerous meetings, and I'm glad to say that during 2019, this year alone, we've had 3 meetings on Mesa in which everybody's participated. That means Qatar and Saudi Arabia and the Egyptians and others. And we think that this is an important initiative and a priority for us as a way of continuing to get at Gulf unity and using this mechanism to address some of the regional challenges that we've talked about.
And finally, an ongoing concern. What are each of the GCC countries' current relationships with the Assad regime? What strategies are you using to discourage these countries from normalizing the relationship with the regime? And how can Congress help you?
Well, thank you. The Gulf countries have taken different approaches to the Assad regime. Some have reestablished relations, much to our discontent. Others are taking a harder line against that and would not reestablish relations under current circumstances. And we are leading an effort to ensure that Syria is not brought back into the Arab League. And I think we have strong support from the Gulf countries not to move on that step.
Thank you for your success. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. Mr. Liu, you're recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Secretary Leonard King, earlier you had said that after the Trump administration terminated refueling, there was still some support of the Saudi-led coalition. It wasn't very much, mostly political. Could you put in writing to this committee what support the Trump administration is still providing the Saudi-led coalition, just so we know what it is?
Yes, of course.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
And then you had also mentioned, back to the Jamal Khashoggi issue, that you're all in contact with other authorities, including Turkish authorities. Public reporting is that Turkish authorities say that Khashoggi's body parts were delivered to the home of the Saudi Consulate General in Turkey. Do you agree with that?
I don't know that that's true or not. I'm aware of the reports. I've seen that, but I don't know that that is true.
Okay. So the CIA has already concluded with high assessment that the Crown Prince ordered the killing of Jamal Khashoggi. Is the State Department doing its own investigation?
Yes, I mean, in the sense...
Who's leading that investigation?
We don't have our own tools necessarily. We have diplomatic tools, but we're relying on other agencies in our government to support that effort.
So...
And fill in the blanks.
So, Secretary, you have 9 Superior Honor Awards from the Department of State. You've been in the Foreign Service since 1993. You know poppycock when you see it. You don't have to shred your credibility for the Trump administration. The CIA has assessed with high credibility. If you all don't want to believe that, then you need to go do your own investigation, tell us who's leading it, and then tell us you found something else. But for now, I just find it hard to believe you are just simply not agreeing to the intelligence professionals of our own American intelligence agencies. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Liu. Mr. Malinowski, you're recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for your patience, Mr. Linder King. A couple of other issues that are subject of ongoing conversations amongst us. One, you and I have spoken about the case of an American citizen detained in Saudi Arabia, Dr. Walid Fatahi, and I want to just ask you for an update on that case and for your assessment of why, given the harm that the Khashoggi case has done to the U.S.-Saudi relationship, the Saudis continue to hold without due process, without charge, an American citizen. It's sort of inexplicable to me.
It's inexplicable to us as well, to be honest. We've raised this case. I've raised it personally on my last trip to Riyadh just a few weeks ago. As an American citizen, the administration, we always take these cases very seriously. We have not seen any justification for why he's detained. We are able to see him on a regular basis, which is very important to verify his well-being. And we have sought to make sure that his family can also have regular access to him. We're hopeful for a resolution.
Thank you. And then the second quick issue, a number of us have sent the Secretary a letter on the use of child soldiers by the coalition in Yemen. There's been very, very significant public reporting that large numbers of child soldiers from countries like Sudan are doing the ground fighting. If true, this would obviously violate the Child Soldiers Protection Act and would require some action on our part. I'm wondering if we can expect an answer to that letter at some point soon.
You can. The child support reports are very concerning to us, and we are looking into them, and we will respond.
Thank you so much.
Yep, thank
I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Malinowski. And finally, Mr. Lenderking, just a couple of questions before we close out. On the GCC rift, the State Department recently said a united GCC is the backbone for regional peace, prosperity, security, and stability, and is essential to countering the single greatest threat to regional stability, the Iranian regime. Does the administration believe that the intra-GCC dispute can be resolved in the near term, or is this just now a part of regional politics?
We don't think it's going to be just part of the regional architecture. We do think that with proper commitment and mediation, sticks and carrots, that we will get to a resolution here in the near term. We're very hopeful of that.
Can you describe those sticks and carrots for us?
Well, we've talked about how negative this situation is for the Gulf and the fact that it pushes Qatar to the unfortunate reality of having to use Iranian airspace, which puts money in Iranian coffers. I mean, I think that is certainly counter to what we collectively are trying to do. We have called on the Kuwaitis to continue to mediate. We're prepared to support that effort in any way that we can. So I can assure you we'll keep at it.
Well, I appreciate it. I think it's critical that we do everything we can to try to end that rift. And Mr. Trone, I will recognize you for 2 minutes.
Thank you. It's recently reported in Republic that the Saudi government repeatedly has helped Saudi citizens evade prosecution and arrest in the United States and return to the kingdom after they're accused of serious crimes in the United States. Successive U.S. administrations have not raised the subject because of worries the confrontation might jeopardize U.S. interests, particularly counterterrorism cooperation by the Saudis. The Trump administration argues there's little U.S. can do because we have no extradition treaty with Saudi Arabia. The State Department recently said for the first time that it raised the issue with senior Saudi officials. What specific concerns did the State Department raise, and with which officials?
Thank you. This is a concern for us, and we have raised it with the Saudis. There seem to be more cases becoming known than originally thought. We're taking stock of each one of those cases. It's true, we don't have an extradition treaty. That could be an obstacle for us, but we don't think that this is a proper comportment for a diplomatic ally of ours. And so this is something that we will continue to press with the leadership.
That's good, but what are options we could actually do given we don't have the extradition treaty? What are concrete steps?
Not 100% clear, Mr. Congressman, and I think it may require some creative solutions, but first we have to, I think, get better cooperation from the Saudis on this.
Thank you.
I thank the witness and all the members for being here today. Deputy Assistant Secretary Leonard King, thank you so much for your testimony. Members of the subcommittee may have some additional questions for you. We ask that you please respond to those questions in writing, and I ask that my colleagues submit any questions for the witness to the subcommittee clerk within 5 business days. And with that, and without objection, the subcommittee is adjourned.